I don't know if I should apologize. I mean, this section splits across the very end of one part and the very beginning of another part. So that's inconvenient, but as usual, it was a matter of coming up with a reasonable number of pages. So, um, although they're both about temporality, but he shifts gears quite a bit. So the first part was temporality and spatiality, and then the temporal meaning of everydayness. Um, I mean, I think I have a general idea of what he means by the temporality of spatiality. Anyone want to take a jump at what he means by that?
Well, I have a sort of introductory question,
Sure.
and I mean, I don't mean introductory as in it's a good introduction, but I mean just that it's the level of meta introductory level in my understanding. And it's in that first, because you're right, it is these two sections, but and this first section is split up into two, with the first being spatiality, and then everydayness, and the next one being that whole other chapter. But in that section on spatiality, um, uh, I'm with you in that I think I know what he said. Like I remember basically the outline of what was said. But in terms of really grasping it, I feel like I'm weaker there. At least in this the temporal meaning of Dasein's everydayness, that my understanding of that suffered because of my understanding of this first part, but I felt more confident on it. So, but for this first section, my basic understanding uh, is that he's making the claim that a Dasein takes in space and makes room for itself, um, and is self-directive. So Dasein takes in space, it makes room for itself, and is self-directive. Okay, and it does this taking in of space through directionality and deseverance. Um, and I can basically understand that. The directionality and deseverance is just sort of a description of what he sees Dasein doing. I can understand that, but then he makes this point right in the paragraph on Heidegger 360 at the on the last paragraph of Heidegger 360 before getting to section 71. The very last paragraph starts with an italic sentence or an italicized sentence. And I'll read from the Macquarie and Robinsons. That's the end paragraph of Heidegger 369. Sorry, 369. So apologize. I'm so sorry. 370 is where section 71 starts. I'm getting all lost. Anyway, so at the bottom paragraph of Heidegger 369, it starts with an italicized sentence. Only on the basis of its ecstatico-horizontal temporality is it possible for Dasein to break into space. Then he goes on, the world is not present at hand in space, yet only within a world does space let itself be discovered. And then getting more into the ecstatical temporality of the spatiality characteristic of Dasein. There were moments in the text where I felt this was being explained, but it felt like it was a series of moments that I was kind of gleaming what the meaning of this dependence on an ecstatico horizontal temporality was. This is the point of my confusion. The dependence of spatiality on an ecstatico horizontal temporality. I don't I know what both of those things are, I think. I think I know what an ecstatico horizontal temporality is, and I think I know what spatiality is, or at least some of the contours of it, but I don't quite understand, at least thoroughly enough yet, how the dependence uh, works. And if anybody has any, thing, please.
I think that's a really good question, since one of his major themes in this section is that spatiality is dependent on temporality. I have difficulty thinking of spatiality without temporality. So anyway, go ahead, Alistair. No, we can't hear you. You,
How
s-
about
you,
now?
yes, now we can hear you.
Okay.
Now we can hear you.
Yeah, it made some default microphone that wasn't one that I was speaking into, or even one that I have. I don't know. Yeah, it's about I don't know. These sections are new to me. That's why I've been wanting to read along with you all. But I think it's about um, the synthesis of space, the way in which we can do something more than experience space in punctual terms as a series of points. That requires a kind of ecstasis, right? So synthesis and ecstasis are sort of related terms. And the model for that synthesis or ecstasis is temporal. It's because we primarily, it's because we have access to or understand ourselves in a temporality that isn't punctual, that's ecstatic, that synthesizes moments into a whole, or that's not a great way of putting it, but has an ecstatic lived present that extends itself. It's that enables us to synthesize space.
So I'm still not really clear on the notion of ecstatic, but what you just said, you're opposing ecstasis to the punctual.
Right.
Okay. So like for temporality, rather than thinking of it as a series of moments, it's I mean, Chase has made this point. It sounds kind of Bergsonian to me that there's the temporality has this extend, and then it seems like you were associating extended and ecstasis as well.
Yeah, I regret that now, but
Oh, do you?
I
Because
did
I
say
thought that was helpful. Because it like extends time into
yeah,
more than just a
that's
moment.
the full experience of reading Heidegger. You only get it if you constantly feel guilty about everything you say. Right? Oh, that's God. I've just used an ontic metaphor. Shit. Right. But it's a good guilt, because if you feel guilty about it, then you're acknowledging ontological difference and you're in good shape. But yeah, sure, extended, except that extended is a spatial metaphor.
Oh, right.
But he uses, I mean, he's happy to use it in some of these other sections. He talks about Erstreckung, that's a temporal, a spatial metaphor. And, that's one of his things in this text, is and this is Bergsonian, of course. He's resisting the way in which we spatialize temporality. His explication of this fundamental temporality, and I missed those sections, unfortunately, but this explication of this fundamental temporality is an attempt to not think temporality spatially. So he wants to get that in place and then see how we spatialize on the basis of this temporal ecstasis.
But I have a follow-up question, I guess, not necessarily to you specifically about what you just said, but just I guess, to the text and to the group, I guess. And it's first, based on the way that you're kind of employing, or not the way but the way that you're describing how Heidegger's employing these words like ecstasis and synthesis and so on. It makes me think of something that we've read about a little bit before, which was a sort of Gestalt, I'm thinking of that word as it was used by Merleau-Ponty in Phenomenology of Perception and the Gestalt psychology, and his criticisms of it, or of certain styles or brands of Gestalt psychology. So that's my first. Is it something like that? And then the second thing, which is minor, would be, does the is it a fair point to make, and is it referenced here in the text at any point? Does he address this point that it comes up in my mind when I think about using spatiality as a sort of illustrative or a fertile soil for metaphor and allegory for temporal, or descriptions of temporal phenomena, because when I think of it, I think there are distinctions between space and time. I mean, the most important one, and this is one that I know we read a little bit about this in Bergson's Creative Evolution. He talks about not just time, but also his thing about space and the mosaic view and things. But in time, I can totally understand that Gestalt ecstatic sort of perspective or modality, given that many things can happen at the same time, or the present is wholly dependent on the past and wholly, whatever. It's not really a present; it's a sort of having been, being thrown into the past. It's all a confluence of these things that we think of as past, present, future. It's not so simple to atomize. I get that, but in space there is an argument to be made, and I'm not really saying this is a knockdown thing. It's just I don't know how it would be answered. It is true that two things can't occupy the same space at the same time, and in a sense, particular locations, locality is in a sense particular to the thing in that location. It is sort of distinct, discrete locations in a way. I feel. I mean, but maybe I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'm starting. It's a non-starter. Maybe I'm kind of thinking about it wrong. But those are my two things. Is it like a gestalt? And is there any sort of, is that a problem? Is the spatiality temporality difference a problem, or am I just kind of making a mountain out of a molehill?
My sense is spatiality, our initial, I don't know, I guess you could say primordial. I'm always worried that I'm using his vocabulary incorrectly, but that our primordial encounter with space is in this world of things ready to hand, this world of involvement, and is this region. So there's this region of activity, and then that's the primary encounter with space, is a region of activity. And then he explains a little bit about it here, how that, I don't know if he would use the word degenerates, but how that gets interpreted then as like a big empty box with points in it, but that the big empty box with points is a derivative interpretation from a more primordial encounter with space as a region and as a region of activity. And insofar as it is a region of activity, I mean, I don't know, that doesn't mean that a hammer and a drill can occupy the same subregion at the same time, so it doesn't overcome that problem. But at least the problem of you can't have two things occupying the same point, that sort of geometric interpretation is a later, an after the fact interpretation. So I mean, it doesn't completely answer your question, but that's, I think, in terms of the point, the issue of, points and so on, I'm guessing he would say something like that. I mean, it might be interesting. I doubt if he addresses this, but I don't have a clear enough sense of temporality to take this on, but it would be interesting if there was a way to think about temporality and spatiality in the primordial sense and think about the differences between those two. Like you're saying, in the conventional sense, in the everyday sense of space and time, there's a real obvious difference. You can have two things happening at the same time, but you can't have two things occupying the same space. That's very clear. But is there some sort of similar situation in this more primordial encounter with things involving temporality and spatiality? And that I don't know. I would think there would have to be, but because they're not the same thing. I mean, spatiality, what grows out of or something somehow is related to temporality.
Yeah, I think that's more or less right. David, I feel like that. I mean, they're not. He's not saying they're the same. Just that um, just that at some level, temporality provides the model for our understanding of spatiality. So it's more, temporality is more basic somehow. Yeah, I mean, I like the metaphor that comes up for me, which is a little simplistic, is the tool shed metaphor, because equipment is all about tools. And so I'm thinking about the tool shed. And so when he's thinking, I think you're right, when he's thinking about a spatial place, a region, a location, he's thinking about it as something that encompasses things. And not, of course, just it's not like you draw a line around them, right? Like it's the spatiality of equipment is more diffuse than that, because they're integrated by their tools or to hand things are integrated in an equipmental nexus. So the tool shed is not just a place, but it's got the stupid tools in it. But yeah, I think that's when there is he's not going to, I don't think he's going to deny that two things can't occupy at some level the same like bit of space. That's not something he's denying. It's just that when he's thinking about space, he's thinking about it, first of all, when he's talking about a region of space, he's thinking about it as an enclosing region of space, it created by Dasein in relation to Dasein's kind of interest in things as equipment. And that's more basic. You're right, Nevitt. That's the more fundamental experience of space.
Right, and so to I guess what Nevitt is, what you're both saying, then would be that it's not that physics and geometry are incorrect or wrong-headed, but that they are operating at a point where multiple Dasein's regions and horizons had to cross over into each other and then be realms of investment and of care for all the Daseins involved, by which they devised some system like a geometric proof or a blueprint of a house to reconceive the region as something that's not so that's more rigorous, that's more able to be repeated, something, I guess, I don't know how you would classify that, but more ontic, I don't know, that's ontic is lame and fuddy duddies and boring people and normal people, they think in the ontic, but they had to go through the ontology to get there, right? And I can buy that. That's fine. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, except the ontological distinction doesn't quite fit, right? Because you can have you can, like Nevitt says, Heidegger's point is our basic experience of encountering things, and so that's at the ontic level. One of Heidegger's points is that if correctly phenomenologically recovered, that experience, can't say experience, but that experience is different from how we theorize. We tend to theorize about it. So we can have an ontic encounter, right, with equipment, and we can have an ontic encounter with the merely present at hand. So those are both ontic encounters. But Heidegger wants to say, if we pay attention to this phenomenology of the phenomenology that he's giving, of the things are not fundamentally inert, but they're equipmental for us, then we can start doing ontology. And if we don't do that phenomenology first, then we'll do shit ontology, right? Cartesian ontology or something.
God forbid.
There's quite a lot of, there's a huge amount of reference to Kant in these sections. Mm-hmm. Personal favorite of mine. But also Descartes is clearly there in the background, right?
Yeah, so I think there's so he's got this temporality, this is primary or primordial, and then he's got this kind of order of primordiality and then these sort of derivative levels. And let's see, I'm going to try to go through some of what those levels are and see if I don't know if it makes sense or I'm not sure if it would be answering necessarily the question of how does he get spatiality from temporality, but at least I'll be able to recapitulate at least the way that I understand at least some of these levels are working, even though I don't quite understand exactly how they totally mesh together. But okay, so the most primordial is temporality, Dasein's temporality, and that's where you've got the ecstasies, which I think does work kind of like a gestalt, and that's this kind of synthetic unity, and that's that's what gives the unity to Dasein's being, and then from there you've got so temporality is the meaning of Dasein's being. Dasein's being is care, Zorga, and from there you've got a particular mode of that care is concern, at least in this translation, or care in the Standard translation. So Zorga, care, then you got Bizorga, something like that. So from that concern that's put in so you've got the primordial temporality, then a mode of that is concern. From concern, you then get these ways that Dasein is fully absorbed in the world and deals with the ready to hand stuff. From that, you start to then get space in its most primordial aspect, which has to do with this directional aspect of it, these regions, and was it the de-distancing or de-severing, whatever it's called? So the bringing close of things has to do with, well, why the hell does Dasein bring things close? It's because of its whole immersion in its concern, because its being is care. So that's what gives you this aspect of spatiality as founded. Is that Alistair's cat making that noise?
Yes, Alistair, mute your mic. It's hard to hear Chase.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to be able to intervene if I wanted to say something. Sorry.
It's all good.
I found it entertaining. Thank you. Sorry.
There was just some crinkling noise, and so we're wondering if maybe a cat was. We saw your cat walk into the room, so
Yeah, that's why I thought it was maybe
Cats everywhere.
Oh, yeah, so you've got this primordial spatiality that has to do with these aspects of desevering, bringing close things of these items, equipment of concern, and that's the ready to hand. From that, you then get what it would be derivative of that, which has to do with the present at hand and also to do with spatiality and that mathematical projection of that you talked about in the reading, I think it was last time. The mathematical projection of nature that you get where it's based in the ready to hand in our concern, but it gives you this idea of space more so in that kind of scientific mathematical Cartesian sort of way. So I think that's the basic levels there, which I think is you could maybe do it as like a 3-tier thing where it's like a primordial temporality, and then you've got this primordial spatiality, which is connected with Dasein's being as concern. And then you've got the third level of kind of 2 levels of derived from ultimately temporality, where you've got the president hand, and you've got also the concept of space that goes along with that. So I don't know exactly how you really get from one to the other. I tried to explain the best I can, but I don't really fully get it. So I don't know.
So I have a speculation here. Like Alistair mentioned that Kant is kind of lurking in the corners here. So, I mean, I hesitate to say this because I know Heidegger, or at least I understand that Heidegger really is trying to undercut the subject-object distinction as a primary distinction. But, given that Kant thinks that time is the form of what he calls inner experience, and then space is the form of outer experience, that maybe that's related to Heidegger's prioritization of temporality because again, not because I'm not saying Heidegger's trying to say, well, it's the inner sense, because again, he's trying to finesse that distinction, but that in a similar way that temporality is kind of a prime, or that time for Kant is kind of an immediate way that our internal intuitions are formed, that maybe temporality is primary in a similar reason for Heidegger, that temporality is primary because that is our kind of most immediate I'm not sure what to say, structuring framework or something, and that then spatiality emerges insofar as we are engaged in this environment and doing things. And so then we have this primary temporality, and then action. When you're doing things, now you're interacting with a region of equipment for some purpose, and now you're having that ecstasis becomes spatial in the sense that you're not only working in an extended temporal, I don't want to use the word moment because that has a special meaning for him that I don't understand pretty much at all, but that you're working in this extended temporal whatever, and then now you're reaching out and acting in a region. And so then there's that ecstasis where Dasein is now projecting not only temporally but also spatially into a region of activity. So I'm wondering if that's a way to think about the why temporality is primary, and then spatiality kind of emerges insofar as then Dasein begins to project itself into a world of activity.
Yes. Yeah. It's he mentions Kant on, like, at the beginning of the reading, 367 German, on specifically that issue of the priority. So Kant is someone who he's learning, how can you say this play? He's learning a lot from, but there's a kind of narcissism of minor differences, and every time he realizes he's gotten really close to Kant, he's like, no, but this is not what Kant said. No. But then he gives some dumbass argument, and that's exactly what happens here. It's like, and what I'm saying is totally different from what Kant says about the priority of time over space. And then he says, because Kant is treating space as something merely present at hand. And it's like, oh, come on. Martin. You can do better than that. That's your just like go-to term of abuse. Is it what is and what for me? That's a signal that he's really taking something important from Kant at this point. And I think that's right. And I mean, in a lot of ways, Kant has a better explanation, right? I mean, what Nevitt just said is more concrete, right, than what Heidegger is saying about the relationship of primordial temporality to primordial spatiality. Like, why is it? I was conscious when I was giving my explanation. I'm like, well, okay, this is an explanation, I guess, but it seems circular. Like, why is temporal ecstasis more fundamental than spatial ecstasis if it's ecstasis? And you'd expect maybe a phenomenological account, and I don't know, because I have not been reading along with you, so I've missed those previous sections. Maybe he has given a good phenomenological account of temporality, which makes it clear why our understanding of temporal ecstasis is better than our spatial one, but it's not in that section 17. Whereas Kant has a very clear explanation for why time is more basic than space, right? Inner experiences are temporal, but not spatial. Outer experiences are both spatial and temporal. So I think that's right. Chase, I think you're right about the I mean, the stuff about hierarchy here is complicated, though, right? It is difficult because Heidegger doesn't want there to be a hierarchy, except between the ontic and the ontological. But it does seem like there is, and that's so. I mean, there's a literature on Heidegger in space. It's not like I'm super familiar with it, but I've read one or two things. And I mean, this book is people complain about this book because it has such a lackadaisical account of space. I mean, even if you think time has this priority, really, you got like 2 sections on space. So early in Division 1, there's something about existential spatiality and the yonder or whatever it is, and then there's this section, and that's pretty much it. So I think people do find the account of spatiality to be somewhat lacking, and I think, Chase, one of the ways in which it's lacking is where does it fit exactly? All right, is there really this hierarchy within ontological conditions, like the time is first and then there's space? And he clearly sort of says that, but then there really isn't space in his in the way he sets things up for there to be that. Like, there isn't like really ontological and then a bit less ontological. There isn't room for that. All spatial metaphors. There isn't room for that in his setup. But I did just want to say one thing, right? Like the at hand and to hand, those are designations for the being of non-human entities, right? So they're on a separate tree. I mean, ultimately, if we're going to pose the question of the meaning of being, then we have to include those because they are, as well as Dasein. But right now he's talking about the being of Dasein. So that stuff is off in a separate category. So that's helped a little bit to clear your hierarchy. I think sort of like some of those things can be just pushed off.
Yeah, it's kind of complicated because it's not like you can have this kind of primordial temporality all on its own, independently of this spatiality, at least in the sense that primordial temporality. So if that's connected with care, Dasein's being, well, concern is a mode of care. So that makes, you're not going to have necessarily care without its mode and concern and spatiality. Without, so it's kind of, I think it is one of those strange kind of, if you want to put it in terms of condition and conditioned, it's still kind of, there's where exactly the prior status is and is still fuzzy. And I believe Heidegger, this is one of the cases where he explicitly criticized his earlier work about this, the priority of temporality over spatiality. And I think in his later works, he tries to have um, he tries to think of some kind of like a genesis out of the, the event, uh, where it's would be more of like a space-time kind of event. Although I say that, but I don't know like almost hardly anything about that work. But I know that yeah, he had his own doubts about exactly what he was doing with this temporality and spatiality thing and being in time. Um, and yeah, the way that he kind of uses a bunch of Kant in a rather tacit manner, and then when it comes, then he only explicitly names him when he then criticizes him in a very flippant manner. Uh, that's how Heidegger. I've realized in reading this, that's how Heidegger does it with everyone. He does it with Kierkegaard. Takes his tons of Kierkegaard, doesn't say when he's doing it, and then puts a footnote and says, "Oh, Kierkegaard is merely dealing with the ontic, the existentiel." And you're like, "Oh God, okay, whatever," you know. And the same thing with Bergson. He's there's a bunch that he gets from Bergson, but he really doesn't want to be conflated with Bergson at all. So he goes out of his way to really disavow Bergson, which is very tricky because he has a lot of the same kind of conceptual maneuvers going on, and one of them being kind of this, well, temporality as a sort of priority over spatiality. Um, but yeah, it's that's the ways of Heidegger, I guess. He was an asshole.
Well, I wanted to say that he sometimes breaks that pattern, and he sometimes he goes even lower. He hits even farther below the
Oh, I
belt.
forgot to mention Husserl. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Well, I think there might be one more that you might be perhaps might be slipping your mind. I can't think of who. But let me see if I can jog your memory. Um, I just
Gee, I
while we're
wonder.
all right. Well, yes. Well, Ed has a good idea, but on it's Heidegger 379 when he's talking about history. I at the top of 379, on the top of the Heidegger 379, it's the first paragraph that starts on 379. In this point, this is just a point while we're talking about how he's kind of referring to certain works, at least with Kant and Husserl and Kierkegaard, he has the dignity, or at least the appreciation for their work enough to imitate their thinking, even if he doesn't admit it. He still liked it. It was good enough that he took ideas from them. But here in Heidegger 379, and this doesn't really have a great, there's not like a strong salient philosophical point to make from this, but he directly, not explicitly, but he references Hegel here, and then says that he's gonna like take a little bit of a lesson from Hegel and from all these people he's mentioned, and he totally does not do that. So let me just get to why I'm irritated with him. On Heidegger 379, the first paragraph, he's describing four modes of understanding the word history. The third out of these modes is this one. Further, history signifies the totality of those entities which change in time, and indeed the transformations and vicissitudes of men, uh, of human groupings and their cultures, as distinguished from nature, which likewise operates in time. Here, what one has in view is not so much a kind of being, historizing, as it is that realm of entities which one distinguishes from nature by having regard for the way in which man's existence is essentially determined by spirit and culture, he puts in scare quotes, even though in a certain manner, nature too belongs to history as thus understood. So this is he's basically said it's like he's said it's like Wayne's World. He's doing like an aside. He's like, some people think of history as this, totality with spirit and culture. Who would say crazy kooky stuff like that? That's totally wild. And this is very, I mean, to me, maybe I'm a paranoiac neurotic, which I am, but maybe I'm not, I'm seeing things that aren't there, but it seems like that's a reference to Hegel's conception of history. A kind of a weird one, because I would say nature is definitively a part of history in Hegel. And it's a little odd that he doesn't seem quite solid on his interpretation of Hegel's notion of history. He seems a little shaky on his idea of Hegel. So he's like, nature's kind of there, but it's kind of not. I don't really get it. Whatever. And then he gives some other fourth account. And the final paragraph, this is where I have my issue with what he just said. He says, if we take these four significations, this is still on 379. If we take these four significations together, the upshot is that history is that specific historizing of existent Dasein, which comes to pass in time. So that the historizing which is past in our being with one another, and which at the same time has been handed down to us and is continually effective, is regarded as history in the sense that gets emphasized. That does not seem to include what the third notion of history was. That, I mean, again, I have two questions. Maybe this one, not a quite. First one is me bitching. The second is a real question that will get us back on track towards philosophical discussion. My bitching is that I do not see a specific historizing of existent Dasein, and which at the same time has been handed down to us and is continually effective. That doesn't seem to be like the third notion of history that he gave, the Hegelian notion. That does not seem to be incorporated into this. His like, what these can all agree on here is this. I would say no. That's I don't see how that follows. But that's just me bitching. The second thing, the real actual philosophical thing, hopefully somewhat, maybe potentially at least heading a trajectory towards philosophy, is that maybe this is an indication, I'm too simple to understand what this historizing that he's talking about is in context with the rest of his project. So as far as I understand it, a specific historizing of existent Dasein, that's really local. A specific historizing of existent Dasein. So he would really think that pre-human history, prehistoric, that's really prehistory for him. That's actually prehistory, which I don't see how that works. But moving on, comes to pass in time, so the historizing which is past in our being with another. So history is this story told between people, sort of, and which at the same time has been handed down to us, right? A handing down, a passing on of the past from one Dasein to another in their being with another, and is continually effective. History is not always effective. In fact, Hegel makes a point in Reason and History that the rabble, that the uneducated mass or women and children in the crowd while the king is giving his speech, the murmurs of women and children and the poor peasantry in the crowd listening to the king, it has the immense historical advantage of being historically unimportant, of being the thing not handed down. That is effective in history. And so I guess I know. Well, I think Nevid, I thought that this section, it was all about this sort of broad sweep of these different understandings of history. And then he was trying to say at the end of those different approaches to history, he was like, check out, here are 4 different approaches. Here's what I would say is the most concise way to put what they're all trying to say. Right.
I agree with you. So I'm not disputing, I'm not disputing your criticism.
Sure.
I just wanted to make the point that I think this entire section is about what he's identifying as the common, vulgar, everyday notion of time, of history, which is wrong, or at least not ontologically prior. And this is sort of a preliminary, because his approach, it seems like it's always been, we've got to start with what we have, which sounds like Aristotle. We've got to start with what we have, and what we have is this vulgar or common notion of history. And once we can use that as a starting point, we can begin to kind of investigate what what is the more primordial notion that this is an interpretation of. So I just wanted to make that point that none of this is something I don't think anything in this section is something he is endorsing as a notion of
Right.
history.
I
But,
guess
that doesn't address your criticism that when he summarizes it, he doesn't actually summarize it accurately.
well, and then I guess what you could say, if I were Martin Heidegger and you said, yeah, well, your summary doesn't accurately describe, I think if I were him, I would be tempted to do the G.E. Moore style hand wave and say, well, they're all wrong. Get out of my face. I don't know. So I told you that a wrong thing was wrong in a wrong way. Whatever. They're all wrong. Okay, shut up. So maybe he would say, it doesn't matter. What? Maybe I summarized it poorly. Sorry, I didn't pay attention to it because it's stupid. Maybe he could say that. But this was the point of confusion for me, Nevitt. I like what you're saying, that this is just more of like an explication of how wrong people can be. But here was my point of confusion on that specific issue. And it was that here he's saying the word history, and then it seems like when he's talking about the thing he likes, or what we would both agree is what he's endorsing or trying to explain is historicality and historicity or whatever. Historicality, historiological analysis. But he didn't, I don't remember him picking up the word history again. And so when I think of, I didn't see him offer like here's what history really is. Now that we're done listening to those idiots, here's what history is really about. And if there is, I'd actually like to, because I remember I was looking through this, the historical character of antiquities and the primary historical and the secondary historical. But I had a hard time teasing out what he's endorsing and what he's critiquing and what is his version of history. And I guess the reason that I kind of assumed, to be honest with you, Nevitt, I kind of assumed that paragraph that I just read was kind of his description of history. I think the big reason I thought that, if it's erroneous to think that, the reason I thought that was that it's the most fleshed out explanation of history that he offers. It seems, maybe I'm wrong, actually, because my mind's not a steel trap or anything, so I might have,
Well, this is I think this section, again, as he often does, is he goes through the I don't know if incorrect is the correct word, but quite the right word, but the common interpretation of things as a precursor, as a preparation for an existential interpretation. And I think the thing is so the next section, which was not part of the reading for today, is called The Essential Constitution of Historicity. And the next section after that is called The Historicity of Dasein and World History. So, my thinking is that section 73, he's giving us this common or vulgar interpretation and then transitioning from there into his existential interpretation of history. And with regard to those words, I frankly have a hard time keeping a historicity, historic, all these HIST words. I have a hard time keeping them straight and remembering which one means what. So I'm not sure about that.
Same. Hard same. And before I forget, I wanted to ask, forgive me for being distracted with the boys too, but for the spatiality, he seems to be so like if the existences of temporality is tied to my being and is finite, and it seems to be an authentic understanding of time, and then he seems to be also saying that, and I want to make sure I'm getting this right, or if it is correct, that's the authentic understanding of time. Infinite is the inauthentic understanding of time, because it's a projection of all of these possibilities, all the tools in the tool shed that Alistair mentioned. And then when it comes to spatiality, he seems to be tying it to being in the world, and it's not independent in the world, and it doesn't originate from Dasein, but it's in our temporal existential relationship to Dasein in the projects that we undertake, manifest, and care. Because it almost seems like, and I put it dialectical it's like this relational component of spatiality to design that does seem to borrow a little bit, at least my understanding from Hegel. Is that a correct understanding of spatiality that is somewhat limited in his explanation?
Well, I think in some sense, Dasein is being in the world, or I'm not sure that's quite right because I want to say Dasein is care, but so I'm not. I mean, I think of this as the. Oh, have you got to go? Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's too bad.
I was hoping I could get Alistair to answer that one, but
Yeah,
oh
I'm
well.
sorry. I should have not. Right on. But I was, I think of like if there's a dialectical thing, I think of it as kind of like, Husserl has this intentionality of consciousness. So there is never a subject without an object. There is never consciousness without a world. The two are kind of dialectically related. And I think of Dasein is you never have Dasein without a world, and you never have a world without Dasein. But Dasein is being in the world. And so I don't know, your comment there made me think that you were saying that Dasein was distinct from being in the world, and I have a hard time thinking of it that way.
No, it's not. Like he seems to be saying it's not distinct from being in the world, but it doesn't originate from Dasein, but it's not its own objective object in space. It only originates or only gets its I don't know meaning in the relationship to Dasein and its projects.
But wait, I'm sorry. Can you clarify something, Joseph? Because I actually first I wanted to because I wanted to kind of respond to the sort of dialectical relationship that you were teasing out, because I think there are certain things I everybody you say that word to, it's like a Rorschach test for if they're insane. And you say the word dialectical, and so based on my totally sound mind and body, I would say yes, I see certain things, relationships between terms at play within this text that I would say interact in a dialectical fashion at times. But I see Heidegger actively, like, pardon my French, everybody, but shitting on the dialectic. um, it not just in the sense of saying, "Here's a way to do this." He describes the dialectic. That's stupid. That's one way to shit on the dialectic. The other way is to kind of half engage with it and then kind of drop it at odd points and find your own new cool thing kind of out of it without ever mentioning it, as he does with Bergson and certain other things. There are flags in my book for when we get to the next, after the meeting, after we finish this book and we get into our 2 weeks of bitching about Heidegger and what an asshole he was or whatever, that we discussed over email. That's not just about Heidegger's more biographical stuff we're going to get into. That's when I'm going to start breaking out the book flags. We're going to get to the things I flagged. We will be talking about Heidegger and his treatment of the dialectic. I can assure you that. I am building a case. I'm like, hey, I'm going into law school, I need to have a solid case against this guy before we press charges. But, but really, this was what I wanted to know, Joseph. Yeah, did you, are you, are you saying that, so you're not saying that being in the world, you're saying that Dasein and being in the world are identical? Right? Or is that what you're saying? Because I would say I thought that was the case, that being in the world is literally, that is what the word Dasein in German means. Right? I mean, I don't know German, so
Uh, I was trying to
Being
say, and
here.
I wasn't phrasing it right, that space doesn't originate from Dasein. It doesn't come from Dasein, and it's not objectively independent in the world, but it's disclosed in a way by Dasein through the relationship to it. So I probably typed that wrong.
oh, okay, wait, so maybe, oh, okay, so based on what Eric and Chase and what you're saying, I think that would be right then. I think what you're saying would be right then, right? If Dasein is a being there, and Dasein's kind of being is being in the world, then what you're saying would make sense, right? That Dasein's or spatiality coming from being in the world, or at least being in the world being a necessary element of spatiality, right? I mean, being there in a there. See, this is an issue that I have with Heidegger. I mean, oh God, I sound like a broken record. But when I say, because I'm getting twisted up right now, I'm saying like I'm reading off your message and I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I'm trying to piece together, like, okay, I think I'm in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, Joseph is making a very clear statement here that seems in line with the text, holding fidelity to the text. Spatiality seems to come from being in the world. I agree. There has to be a world for the spatial, like, and a being in it for that spatiality to enter the frame at all. But not from Dasein. I then am like, I'm like, sure, it comes from the being in the world. But I thought, does the being in the world come as like a mode of the Dasein? And so therefore, being in the world and spatiality both come from Dasein? And at that rate, does Dasein, are we going to talk about where Dasein comes from, like ontically, like the sort of, you know what I mean, the external scene of production outside of the scene of representation, and Dasein's material makeup out of a non-being, like
Or
Dasein.
where did babies come from?
Exactly. Where do babies come from, Heidegger?
Storks.
Right. Yeah, the storks that were already there in the world.
Always already there.
Yeah, yeah.
But I wonder again if you know Heidegger would say that's just beyond the scope of his project here, because he's trying to explicate, you know, the meaning of being, and he can only do that from Dasein, and Dasein's kind of being is being in the world. And so, you know, there are certain questions that extend beyond the scope of this. And with regard of, you know, with which came first, I don't think that's a question that a phenomenologist can answer, because that would require you to be outside the domain of Dasein to examine Dasein and the world and to observe how they come into being. But I mean, again, this is kind of the pseudo-Cartesian viewpoint of, you know, what we can only know from where we are. And so I think of it in terms of disclosure. So it's not like, it's kind of not a fair question to say, well, where was space before Dasein? Well, that's like, again, like that's asking Husserl, what is the world without consciousness? That's just it's not an answerable question, because we are always only from the perspective of consciousness. And so for Heidegger, we are always only Dasein, and we can only answer questions from this frame. And so what happens is this kind of being, as Chase said, this kind of being that is being in the world discloses a world. It makes that world appear in a sense, but that's not like it's literally generating it out of some sort of subjective consciousness. It's discovering a world. It's disclosing. It is making apparent. And if you ask, well, what was that world prior to Dasein encountering it? That's not a sensible question. It's not an answerable question.
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement there. It might as well ask, what is the thing in itself? Right?
Yeah.
And I mean, pursuing, I mean, I was going to say this earlier when Alistair was talking. I mean, I've been thinking about it in these terms, but especially this section. I can see how he's borrowing heavily from Kant and then keeping Kant away at an arm's distance, right? But it seems like he is very much taken on board the Copernican turn. But instead of it being an epistemic kind of theme, instead of saying, you know, we can, you know, instead of asking how objects in the world, how our knowledge and cognition can conform to objects in the world, and reversing that, and instead of it being epistemic, it's ontological. And instead of saying, and where Kant is largely the way he sets it up in the first critique, it's receptive. It starts with intuition. I want to say with Heidegger, it takes the opposite. It's ecstatic. So rather than receiving time and space as forms of intuition, we are already spatial and temporal, and we stretch ourselves temporally and spatially, and then we get a world, right? We get a world, but it's very much a way of thinking after a Copernican turn, right?
Yeah, that's better than me bringing in Descartes, because then somebody's going to say, no, he hates Descartes. But I think that's the Copernican turn is probably a better way to look at that.
But I mean, you could also argue what Kant was doing was taking something started by Descartes, but not very close to completion, and then bringing it further to what he thought would be completion, which is this modern mode of philosophizing about metaphysics, right?
And would it be better to say that Dasein is the framed, constructed, constituted as being in the world then when it comes to spatiality?
What I was saying, and I didn't get an official imprimatur from Alistair, so I'm not sure if this is correct. But the way I was describing it earlier is Dasein in activity. So as Dasein, and I mean, to something that Eric's brought up a bunch of times is just there's all of these sort of echoes of German idealism here, that activity in a sense is what's really primary, but that insofar as this temporality, the structure of temporality acts, insofar as it engages in a world, spatiality emerges from that engagement. Because when you're in the workshop and you're doing something, you're reaching out to get a hammer. You're looking across the room to see the saw. And so spatiality just sort of emerges as through this engagement in a world. So maybe the short answer to your question is yes. But that's the way I'm thinking about it, is it space. And it's not like, it's again like asking Husserl, or someone asking Husserl, well, what was the world prior to conscious beings? I don't know. You don't either, because you're a conscious being. And as soon as you imagine a world without consciousness, there you are, a conscious being imagining that world. And I think, Heidegger would say a similar thing. You say, well, what is space prior to Dasein engaging in projects in a world? I don't know. I mean, I'm Dasein, you're Dasein. We got nothing more than that. That's what we are. That is our kind of being. And so all I can tell you is spatiality emerges. I want to say emerges more than constructed, because constructed makes me think more of the traditional sort of space-time box, like a Cartesian framework of points or something, but that spatiality kind of emerges as Dasein engages in activities in this world of projects.
Okay, and then it's that disclosure by Dasein in this world of projects, and then your temporality, your ecstasies in it, that kind of have this unique individuation in the projects that you choose to care about and then dread of. And I'd kind of like the idea of playing with that from a dialectical relationship aspect a little bit. Like that disclosure, that relationship to Dasein is key in temporality and your own formation of self.
Okay, one thing about the dialectic, so I don't know, maybe part of this is just my own ignorance of the dialectic, but I think at least some of the things that we've been rather harsh on Martin today, so maybe I'll try to somewhat like give try to have the old Nazi possess me and give some kind of a defense. But okay, so the dialectic, I think what he may have a problem with putting things in terms of that would be that the dialectic seems to involve some kind of like a succession in history, and the movement is involved with that, where what he's talking about is something that's prior to any kind of a successive kind of like staged movement of different things. Just, it wouldn't be within necessarily like within history or within time that you have, these interactions between these all these structures that he's talking about, and then different structures emerge within time as something else. So, because I think he's more uh like Kant or Schopenhauer in that he's saying that even something like time isn't something that changes in its structure within time, because you need time as kind of the condition for what in a derivative sense becomes successive experiences and events in time. So maybe that's a complete misunderstanding of the dialectic. It probably is, but I think at least that's what Heidegger would say about that aspect of it. But
Because I was thinking, and forgive me, I'm having this idea like I'm cluttered, right? And I am ADHD to the max. And one of the things we do is create piles, right? And we create piles that are unique and functional to us. And my piles are unique to my projects that I'm doing. And if I just try to define spatiality of that project that I'm doing with my piles between the difference of this pile and that pile, it doesn't make any sense to me. But if I do it in terms of, well, this is the pile for the ferret's food, and this is the pile I keep for my technology books, and this is the pile I keep for my philosophy books. But that's unique to me in my individuation. That spatiality is unique to me. So it's like this participation in the temporality of my existence and the different projects and concerns I have. And like they may be inauthentic projects because they don't uniquely define me, but they're also authentic projects when I think about like the end or the temporality of my being. So I don't know. I want to play with that. Like just spatial difference alone doesn't necessarily differentiate what a project is. A project is unique to the individual who actually undergoes the project and its disclosedness of design. I'm going to play with that. I want to think more about that. I just wanted to say that before I forgot. Please forgive me.
yeah, so I think do you want to go, Hunter?
Well, yeah, I just I guess, well, actually, well, I mean, if you have something directly in response to that, that would probably be more important too, because I wanted to respond to something that Nevitt said in the chat, but in order to do it, I would need to get into some meat and potatoes or something. But do you have a response to
No, just basically I wouldn't know exactly like a definitive answer, but I think what you're getting at, Joseph, is something that's kind of like this. There's another tension in Heidegger between, you got these existential structures, they condition things, and then you've got the existential and the ontic. And he talks a lot about where do these things actually play out? Well, they play out for individual Daseins. There's no just Dasein in general. You can talk about it in a like structural philosophical way like that, but ultimately what actually exists is a Dasein. And that has to occur on a level that is existential, that is individual in that way that I think you're talking about.
Right, right. Like the measurements don't matter. The measurements, you don't want to like the readiness at hand of spatial difference doesn't really matter. It's my my aspect of what is he called, authentic concern in regards to the readiness at hand, that is that determines like the accessibility of the projects. Like that's an interesting concept to me, and I want to play with that more. I'm gonna write that down before I forget that.
Yeah, I think though he wants to, so if he's successful, I think he wants to completely, he wants to be able to subsume the existential within these existential structures as much as possible and not have any kind of additional leakage of the existential. But at the same time, there's this element that is, you know, the uniquely individual particular things that actually happen that, you know, no theory can give you that, you know.
And if we get wrapped up in the spatiality, it ends up being with like what Nevitt said. It becomes this ontic thing that I end up losing or getting, like what Alistair called like bad ontology, the Cartesian ontology.
But you're all but if I was understanding you all correctly, there is everybody has a Dasein.
Everybody is
Yeah.
Okay.
instance
then,
of.
well, but then that's connected to individuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, one ontological. I mean, this is where I think the bridge is. One ontological characteristic of Dasein is that Dasein is always factical individuals thrown into the world. And so, I mean, so Dasein as an ontological structure, there you're talking about ontology, but one ontological characteristic, or not one ontological feature of Dasein, is that it always exists as particular individuals at a particular place in a particular point in time and all that. And so that's where that's where you shift from the ontological to the ontic, from the existential to the existential. Is that correct, Chase?
Yeah, I think so. He says something towards the very beginning of the book. I can't remember exactly where he's first talking about existence, where he says something along those lines of Dasein's existence is done in this existential manner. So they have this necessary link. Because I mean, if you think about it, it wouldn't really make sense if there wasn't that link. I mean, how the hell are they connected then? Like, what the hell is the structure even of, if it's not of ultimately these actually existing Daseins, which will have these, these ontic aspects that they're not necessarily like contradicting the structure, the existential structure, but the existential structure doesn't tell you every ontic detail about everything.
Well,
It's
no,
not-
right, but that makes sense to me. But then isn't that? I mean, this idea of I was trying to write it down, Nevitt. The one ontological feature instead of characteristic of Dasein is it always exists as as a particular individual, particular time in a particular space. Well, wouldn't that be the whole idea of? And I don't know if it's in this work, but other works where it kind of emphasizes the choice that a person makes is legitimate if it's authentically that person's choice, right? That if he chooses it and he's not just following what somebody else does, but it's authentic to himself, that's what made it, for lack of a better term, please feel free to use another term, legitimate.
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of true, but authenticity includes more than that, because you could have a person, an inauthentic person. I mean, so an inauthentic person, I think, is just a person who is completely wrapped up in the world, and they accept their possibilities as those possibilities that are defined by their contemporary culture and all that kind of stuff. And you could have a person who says, a person wrapped up in that says, fuck all this shit. I'm gonna make a choice that is this direction. But that doesn't necessarily make that person an authentic person just because they make a choice as some kind of independent thing. Authenticity, and I don't know, Chase would be better at me than describing the whole structure, but it involves, this resolute, attention toward, facing death and embracing the anxiety that is associated with that. And so an authentic choice, I think, would have to emerge from that whole package of what constitutes authenticity, not merely just saying, I'm going to make my choice and it's my own choice and nobody else's choice.
And what makes it authentic then?
That the person, the Dasein is, its authenticity is a mode. Was it be a mode of being? Would that be the way to put it, Chase? More or less a mode of being of Dasein in which it has come to face with its, with its, the fact that it's being toward death, and that it is willing to, not the word experience, but it is willing to take on this anxiety that's associated with it and realize that its possibilities are indeterminate. Although through a conversation with Chase today, that's not really true probably. But so authenticity is that whole stance, that whole way of being in the world that is not, it's not merely and only making a choice that's my choice and nobody else's choice. Authenticity involves that whole package.
Sure. But I mean, when you were bringing up the anxiety, a person willing to take on the anxiety because there's no certainty of the consequences of your action, right? It's contingent. The universe is contingent. And so it would be, begging your pardon, more authentic if the person didn't know that they would necessarily going to be successful, if the authenticity as a mode of design accepts the anxiety, accepts the unknown, accepts the uncertainty of the future.
I think that's true to some degree, although I wonder, and maybe Chase would be better, know this better too. I'm wondering if you're channeling Sartre more than Heidegger on some of these things, because I mean, that sounds like the kind of things that you're describing sound a lot like the kind of things that Sartre says. And I think there's some differences between the two, not all of which have I figured out yet. But that whole thing about, freedom, I am free to make the choice that I make, and it's my choice and nobody else's, and I have to be free to accept the consequences of my action, no matter what they are. That sounds a lot more like Sartrean existentialism to me. And I mean, he pulled a lot from Heidegger, but I'm guessing Heidegger would say he took it off in a different direction that is not exactly like Heidegger.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's this one part that, let me see if I can find this quote. Oh, here, I think I found it.
I have to jump off, gentlemen. Always appreciate you.
Hey,
Thank you.
thanks
Take
for
care, Joseph.
See ya. Okay, so I think this is it. Oh, God damn it, I don't have a page number with this.
How dare you?
I know. Hold on one second. I'm gonna find this real quick and get a page number. Actually, you know what? Whatever. I'm just gonna read this. Okay. So, well, to give a little preface to it, is I think there's there's a lot of complicated stuff going on with, in terms of the way he talks about, taking up certain aspects of, thrownness, and then this resoluteness, and then taking action with that. And I think this quote gives some kind of resolution to it, I guess. Whatever. I'm just going to read this. Resoluteness, by its ontological essence, is always the resoluteness of some factical Dasein at a particular time. But on what basis does Dasein disclose itself in resoluteness? Only the resolution itself can give the answer. The resolution is precisely the disclosive projection and determination of what is factically possible at the time. To resoluteness, the indefiniteness characteristic of every potentiality for being into which Dasein has been factically thrown is something that necessarily belongs. Only in a resolution is resoluteness sure of itself. The existential indefiniteness of resoluteness never makes itself definite except in a resolution. Yet it has, at all the same, its existential definiteness. So it seems like the resolution does have a definiteness that, but it still works within that existential indefiniteness. But the thing is, you can't give any kind of a ontological analysis that will give you a specific resolution. It can only be that particular Dasein, some factical Dasein at a particular time. And that would be, in its resoluteness, would give you some kind of an existential answer and be able to give then some kind of definiteness to go along with, in its everydayness, would be this kind of immersion in the indefiniteness of all the potentialities for being in which Dasein has been factically thrown. So it's kind of got like it's got both these aspects of a lot of the things that we're talking about, whether it's like indefiniteness and definiteness, or, kind of like individual, or, I mean, well, that's kind of, that one's somewhat beside the point. So we'll get into that next week when he starts talking about the collective destiny and fate and all these things where we get from our heritage, and also the soil, which has to do with our Volk and the people. Yeah. Uh-oh. But anyways, so yeah, it's hard to say a lot of these things, like I look at these quotes and like that's really relevant, but I can't really say exactly like what is going on with these quotes. They're just, I don't know. He's a confusing guy.
I was trying to find in the Bourdieu. I don't know if you guys noticed the Bourdieu I posted in the Discord, but I want to say it was there. If not Bourdieu, it was somewhere else. I want to say I read somebody, I think it was Bourdieu, that said that Heidegger's one of his concerns in being in time is to kind of refute Lukács. And so again, if we want to understand like why he's so obsessed with history, and going back to Hunter's beef, I read that, and again, Hegel pops in my mind, but I'm thinking, again, because I already read this Bourdieu, I think it was Bourdieu who said this, I'm thinking Heidegger's more directly thinking of Lukács, and then behind Lukács thinking of Hegel, right? If that helps you. I forgot where I was going with that exactly, but with regards to history, we said it on Wednesday, right? And during discussion at Endgame, this is very much like this time in the early 20th century, especially the interwar period. Like intellectuals were obsessed with the question about time, temporality, history, and a rapidly changing world, because modernity seems to be really taking like a firm hold of the earth. And
Well,
then,
but
go ahead.
I think it's because of that, but I also think it was the shock of World War One.
Oh yeah, that's what I was saying. It's
Yeah.
a large piece of this. I agree. Right? That's a large part of why. Yeah, a large part of the shock of war. I mean, the shock of World War One, to me, lurks in the background of this work of being in time. Like I think we said it last week, or I said it last week. It's concerned, and it's not just World War One, right? It's concerned to address creeping nihilism, and this is a modernity issue, but. Look at the devastation, look at the carnage and the catastrophe of World War One. Does that not bring to a crisis point, this wrestling with nihilism? Right. So, I mean, yes, absolutely. Right. And it's because, especially in the early 20th century, intellectuals were concerned about historicity as such. That I see Heidegger as just par for course. You know what I mean? Is prioritizing temporality over spatiality. And then I don't know if you're familiar with Frederick Jameson's postmodernism book. He talks about what constitutes the logic of postmodernism is a kind of a flipping of that, where we prioritize spatiality over temporality.
Thanks. Yeah, there's I mean, this is a painting, not philosophy, but there was a very famous painting of the 1920s, and it had a very sarcastic title, but it was, I think, beyond sarcasm. It says something like, we are making a better world. And all you see are these this blighted landscape with dead trees. I mean, there's nothing growing. It's just a bunch of dead trees, stumps. Maybe they have a few limbs, but nothing's growing. And it was that sense of no matter what was said about what was being done, this is the devastation that came from it. And so I could see there being a lot of different kinds of responses to it, which I think that's one of the reasons why Nazism wasn't necessarily responded to so forcefully, because of when they did feel so sure of themselves and what they were fighting for, and then after the 5 years of bloodshed, what did they really get?
And people are looking for something definite and clear and so on to attach to, someone that can give them good complete answers and tell them how to get things done.
Yeah, very self-confident. Well, where others are concerned and fearful about that, because they intuit that's what got them involved in World War One to begin with. That certainty, that self-confidence, that assertion of we are doing something that is great and as part of a very long tradition. So the sadness, the great tragedy is you had two different impulses coming from the experience of the Great War. And one was just like a redoubling of belief, and another was deep doubt.
Yeah, a lot of those were kind of like responding to each other in a way. I mean, you can almost see it in Heidegger, where he seems very, he's read his Nietzsche and whatnot. He's familiar with definitely that one aspect of that. Nietzsche was obviously before then, but I think with the history thing that he's going to get into, I think he's trying to go with that other tendency of he's trying to once again find some kind of a solid ground. And that's where trying to find a solid ground in 1930s Germany was maybe a little sketchy. But yeah, so I know Hunter, you mentioned this about the, what is this history thing kind of doing in Heidegger's overall project? And I was kind of wondering the same thing. Is it wasn't really extremely clear to me exactly. But the understanding the kind of historical milieu that he's immersed in, it makes sense that way why he would want to bring this stuff up. But then at the same time also, so I'm not sure how it fits in overall exactly, but I can see where certain parts of it are filling in these gaps that were there. And one of them is to do with kind of like what the hell is going on with with the past basically. Because he goes into some kind of detail in his Heideggerian way about the future, a little about the present, the past, as he talks about as thrownness, it seems still rather abstract and not really fleshed out. I think what he's trying to do in this chapter is flesh that out exactly. And he's going to do it also in a way that I think this is where he's going to try to connect the individual Dasein, and that authenticity is completely wrapped up in that individualizing nature of it, because that's what death is. It's individualizing. And he doesn't really go into a great amount of detail at the individual aspect of it, although he does sort of give an explanation of it. You can see why it would be individualizing, because it's your death. My own most death is my individual. But he's I think with this history, or historizing, he's going to try to then connect that individual authenticity with a kind of collective authenticity in the heritage of a community, taking up its traditions and repeating them. Sounds kind of like Nazism.
Right. And again, that kind of articulation would be a formulation in response to Lukács's history and class consciousness.
Right. Yeah, which I don't know that much about Lukács. Just okay. All I know is basically that he's a Marxist and there's just one annoying
Bloody Marxist.
scholar that he's like a modern day Lukács person, and he was claiming that Bergson was anti-modern and irrationalist. And it's something about like reason, like some fetish about reason. I don't know. It didn't give me a good image of Lukács. This is some person like writing nowadays, but basically all I know about Lukács himself is that he was a Marxist. And Marxist, obviously, there's from Hegel, ultimately, you got this massive role that history is playing. And yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I will defer to you guys who know Hegel, but I thought why he's doing this, I took it as, he just sort of admits he's left this part out. And if you think of Dasein temporalizing and the everyday and all of that, it's all about the sort of local temporal whatever region where someone that someone's occupying, which is great. He's trying to incorporate that, but and it seems like essentially a Hegelian insight is that cultural context has a really long tail, really long, and that long tail has a profound effect on the current state of things. So that's what I took as his primary motive for bringing in history, was just this, and it seems to me, again, not knowing Hegel well, this Hegelian notion that you can't just somehow circumscribe your temporal, place, back 10 years or something like that. That's not going to give you anything.
Well, but by the way, I'm sorry, I'm talking, but there's a thing going on over in the other room. My mom's watching TV, so I'm sorry if it's hard to. But can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
All right, good. No, it's okay. Sorry. But I would say so. Nevit, can I just ask you, like, and I'm not trying to like this is. I keep saying this. I feel like I'm trying to walk back this reputation I have for being some sort of sarcastic asshole. So I'm constantly trying to be like, I know this might come across as if I'm being cheeky or something, but I'm really not. With the point you're making, would it be fair of me to say that it's like, it would be in agreement with Hegel, yes, but also just on that ground, the whole it goes, but the long tail of the cultural context. You could even like Cicero would agree with that when he says, to be ignorant of history is to remain forever a child, for what is the life of a man but a one thread woven in the tapestry of his time. Like Cicero would agree, I think, with that point that like Heidegger's making there with the history thing that you're saying, which is you're not trying to localize yourself, is to remain a child in a sense. So okay, good. So I would agree with that. Totally. But I think that, and this is maybe where we were getting into the chat, where I was talking about my thing in Hegel and other people's thing on Hegel. I would say that if we want to get into a Hegelian direction with history, and I want to see, I don't know, Eric, if I don't know how Eric will feel about this. I don't know how you feel about it. I really don't, actually. Again, that's not me trying to be funny either. But I would say Husserl has some seriously interesting work on the epoche that makes me think of Hegel, particularly in Heidegger and Husserl's disagreement about the epoche and the eternality of the epochs. That the Husserlian methodological reduction, the epoch reduction thing, that thing, whatever his weird little meditative thing he would do, that thing, Heidegger was at certain points in his life kind of like not opposed to historizing or of dealing with epochs, historical epochs, but I think that he was critical of Husserl's claim to this sort of eternal condition or consistency or validity of the process, of the method. And Heidegger tried to emphasize a lot, you're acting in a way as if you have access to something eternal when you don't. You just have this thing that's historically conditioned. And I would agree with that. But I think that in a way, Heidegger admits in other places that eternal conditions are deduced from certain systems, like Marx and Nietzsche. He talks about Marx. I forget where, but I've read Heidegger talking about Marx's notion of alienation and describing Marx's alienation, and Marx and Nietzsche being the sort of semi-nihilist end of metaphysics, not nihilist in the full sense, but nihilist in regards to metaphysics. Like they're both kind of like metaphysics as it was being done is kind of done. It's out. It's not a live option anymore. So in that way, metaphysically nihilistic. So he saw them as operating there, and Marx figuring out this thing, alienation, that spoke to something fundamental. And Heidegger's trying to talk about things that are fundamental, universal, and in a sense, ahistorical, right? And so this set of ahistorical conditions or affects, like alienation, or like the things he describes here as being these necessities of Dasein, I would say that I've seen Husserl kind of try to grapple with that, that sort of imminent coincidence of historicism or historicizing and of eternity, not just figures of eternity or figments of eternity, but of eternity itself. I think that Heidegger's trying to be more conservative, not politically conservative, but more careful with his words. And Heidegger's trying to limit himself, like Nevitt, like you were saying, that whole how can I know before, like just barring questions like that are outside their scope of the analysis, just saying, I'm not gonna I can't, I don't know.
Which
I
I
think
think
that
Eric's right to say that's kind of a Kantian stance.
I agree. Yeah, I also agree. I mean, and Hegel, anytime there's somebody like, oh, do you think that's kind of outside your wheelhouse? He's like, I don't know, fuck it, whatever. I'll write about Egyptian art today. I don't know. He would just try shit like all the time. he saw everything as fitting together like puzzle pieces in a big magical clock that he had built in his brain. At a certain point, I really believe that. But and I think it was good. It was good stuff. It's cool. But I do believe so. That's a difference. But my point is that Heidegger is trying to say that he's dealing with like figures of eternity and is trying to historicize his conceptions of eternity, trying to couch them and say, look, this is historically determined, which is true. But I think that people like Husserl, I've seen at least a little bit more try to assume the true eternality of their ideas as they see it. They see it as being truly eternal.
But
And
that's an affliction of most of Western philosophy, hasn't it? Wasn't it? I mean,
yeah,
that's what I thought
yes.
some of these guys are reacting to is, the Western philosophers have long tried to claim that they're finding these absolutely eternal, truths.
Yeah, I think honestly, I think it's kind of like a weird and I know this is more like of this sort of Hegelian like whatever flip-flopping, inverting, dialectically coinciding oppositions or whatever, but I think my reading of that is that yeah, I think that there have been a lot of claims to eternity, like since Plato, Descartes, this is true forever and it will always be true. And I guess that's been the MO for thousands of years. And my sense is that those claims to eternity, some of them, they might be a little bit, they're a little weird or I don't agree with them. But some of them, I think this is the weird thing. This is the interesting thing to me is that those ideas that we're trying to be eternal are only really true in particular historical contexts. And it's like Descartes. I think that the Cartesian cogito is a weird idea, and I don't know how true it was at the time as like a general historical condition, but as of right now, I think within the frame of like modernity in the post-Enlightenment or in the Enlightenment, and with the mass expansion of commercial reproduction under capital, people do kind of experience themselves now. Only now do we see ourselves as the eternally true Cartesian cogito. Like, and that's just, I don't really even think that's like a rock solid thesis. I'm not really saying that. That's just an example. I'm just like, maybe only now are we really Cartesian cogitos. So I'm saying is that I think Heidegger tries to take the reverse. I think he's trying to say, like, this is true as far as truth can mean anything, but you have to be aware that when I say real absolute truth, it's historically conditioned and determined, and so I'm limited. I'm factically determined. So my descriptions of eternity are going to be factically determined. You see what I'm saying? So I think Heidegger's making a very sensible, rational point, but I think that there's room for people that he criticizes, people like Lukács, people like Husserl. There's room to say that those people are not trying to historicize figures of eternity and say that all they're dealing with is figures of eternity that are historically local, but real instances of something eternal, even if that access is only it's like a window that's only open for a few days as an idea hits your mind. It's like you really do see into something absolute, something eternal, something, even if the terms you're using do not capture it all the way, there's some window that's open in time, and it might close after, but you see the difference, right? I mean, I know that's kind of weird, but I think a good example would be like Plato and his notion of like freedom. I think that there's a case to be made that his eternal form of freedom, existing always and forever, is kind of an odd idea that seems hard to justify. But the idea of some sort of Platonic idea of freedom being co-existent with any form of human socializing, that's a more workable thesis. And that is sort of an indication of like a sort of conditioned access to something eternal, which is odd. I know, but that's what that's all. Sorry. And all this is just to say that that's,
But that sounds like pretty much straight ahead Plato to me, because I think, Plato would say that most people don't have anybody, the only people that have that kind of access are, philosopher kings or philosophers, true philosophers, but that most of us are looking through a dark, a glass
through a
darkly.
glass darkly.
Yeah, and we only see, the distorted view of things. And there are these special rare persons who can actually see into the truth of things, but most of us don't get that. So I don't know, that to me just sounds like Plato.
Well, yeah. No, I guess what I would say is that the distinction I was kind of drawing between like Plato and my sort of little use of Plato is that I feel like Plato was insistent on the reality of the form, and I mean not the reality as in it's like existence within a corporeal space, but the presence of the forms over, above, in, with, I don't know what the word is, I'm sorry, I'm looking for the operative word, but in relation to, in some way, the world itself. And I can, sure, yeah, the forms are more real than the world. Thank you. And what I would say is, I think there's and yeah, you're right. It's like the philosophers are the only ones who can like see that form, but the forms are always there. I'm saying that there's a different sort of approach to that sort of Platonic idea that I think is more what I think I hear from Hegel people, which is that the form literally is like it enters into the frame it's not just visible through that window necessarily, and it's always there over and above. But there's some eternality, there's eternity. It's not some eternal idea of freedom or some eternal idea of a beautiful woman or an eternal idea of democracy or whatever those, but the thing that's common among them is eternity. There's some gesture made towards that in the opening of that window. I'm not explaining it well, but and what about the simulacra? They are awesome. That's my response. But I do think Eric put it well in the chat, but more poetically, what I'm trying to say, which is the Goethe quote: "If you wish to advance into the infinite, explore the finite in all directions." And it's also kind of a foot in Goethe's Faust when he says the spirit of the age is the mind reflecting on that age. It's not just sort of a pithy, like the spirit of the age is just kind of bullshit. That is a sort of name we give to the ruminations of people thinking about the age. It literally, it comes to the fore. It's made, it manifests, it's summoned, it's created out of this. It is that reflecting. And I think that just like that Plato example, that sort of Platonic idea of freedom, it really is there once social organization occurs. But it wasn't there. It's like asking, what math and logic, did they exist before human beings were around, or did we discover them, or did we invent them? Did we invent mathematics? And I think that Plato would say we remembered/discovered mathematics. But I think that Hegel would say, oh, we certainly invented them. Most certainly we invented logic and mathematics. But when we did invent them, we invented something that was truly eternal in a sense. It had some of that eternity in it. there's a historical condition for the possibility of eternity itself. And I know this is all weird, but this is all branching off from this initial thing that we were talking about with Heidegger's treatment of a criticism of other people like Lukács and Husserl for their treatment of history. And this whole thing has been my overly verbose statement in favor of the other side, which is to historicize eternity itself rather than to kind of localize and play with figures of eternity. I think my message to Heidegger: believe in yourself, be confident, get after it, get after that eternity. Come on, it's right there. Don't talk down about yourself like this, like you don't have access to it. Come on, man. That's my message to Heidegger. That's really not much of a criticism, but
Thank you. That's very motivating. I'm totally gonna get my thesis done now. Yeah.
Whatever it takes, Chase.
Yeah, I think I'll be able to do it, hopefully. With Hunter's motivational help. Yeah, so one thing, okay, so this section that we read, honestly, I wasn't really that interested in it until the part that I thought was in the reading, but was actually next week's reading. I thought that part was interesting. Almost none of the part that we actually read this week. I was kind of like read it and was like, blah, blah, whatever, okay. I don't really, what he's trying to do is kind of, I get his method in that he's doing that Aristotle thing of you start with the ordinary concepts of something, in this case history, and then work through that. And then he says that there's aspects of the ordinary understanding that can give you clues to the existential concept. And so that's what he's trying to do. And he goes through these different ideas of history, and it's also connected with this problem that he talks about as the connectedness of life between birth and death, which the ordinary concept believes consists of a sequence of experiences in time. He doesn't like this idea of in time or within timeness, but anyways, I was kind of perplexed about exactly where that was coming from and how that had to do with his big project. And like, I don't know, all this stuff kind of seemed to come out of like it's its own little essay. It almost seems like that's kind of like planted in the book. And then the different ordinary concepts of history, I just kind of like read them and instantly forgot them as they seemed so unremarkable. I don't know if that's that's not really a critique of Heidegger. That's more just like my experience of it. Although one of the parts that was interesting was that part where he mentions the spirit part, but for some reason I thought he was actually endorsing some idea about spirit being involved with history, and I can't find the part. I thought there's the part that Hunter that you read and you mentioned, but I thought there was another part where he talks about spirit, and he talks about it in a way that he seemed to be endorsing.
Oh.
I'm not sure. I may be tripping. I don't know, but
I thought I remember that too.
Yeah, the part that Hunter read in the Stambaugh translation, he uses the phrase "in time," like a series of events happening in time, and I think that's more to the point of what he was attacking with that vulgar notion, not the heritage of a culture, right? Which also seems to be part of that paragraph, but that's precisely what he seems to be holding up as a more robust notion of history. Or a more ontologically appropriate notion of history. Which also I wanted to mention, I don't know if I've probably already sounded off about this once or twice in this group, but back when I used to teach high school, two separate high schools, I heard this from softball coaches. And so they're both social study teachers teaching history, US history or world history. And I about each separate years, but I heard them say, I love teaching history. It never changes. It's always the same, as in the curricula is the same. And they speak about it as if history is just that, just this space where you slot in, discrete events, occurrences, happenings in the world. They either happened or they didn't, and then you either have a complete set or you don't. End of story. There's nothing contestable here. There's nothing that changes, And so I was just kind of like, I hate that these guys are teaching history. You know what I mean? Because they don't even appreciate their own subject and what history really is. You know what I mean? Like, and I always enjoyed history, but then when I went to university in Edinburgh and had my first history class, then I was like, wow, this is even better than I thought. You know what I mean? It isn't just memorizing dates and names. All of those dates and names are really to marshal arguments, right? If they don't serve an argument, then they're what's the point? What's the point in memorizing names of generals, battles, locations, and what's the point of all that if it's not to be put forward in some argument? And again, I've been saying this for years. The reason why we do history is because we need to understand how the world today got to be the fucked up the way it is today, so that we can do something about where we're going for tomorrow. You know what I mean? There is something ecstatic about engaging in historiography to begin with. I think that's part of what Heidegger's getting out here, right? Is the whole project of thinking of history or relating ourselves to history isn't a relating ourselves to a bunch of occurrences or discrete facts as present at hand, dates and names, but real things that have real meaning to us today because we care about freedom or democracy or what have you, and we want to understand how we got here, right? And what to do about it, right?
Well, that's why he was saying temporality wasn't punctual, right?
Right. So it's not,
discrete.
You're welcome to drop names and dates, right, when you engage in argument, but what's the substance of the argument? Let's just say that this freedom in our society today, right? That's the substance of the argument. These facts, these present at hand facts about history may be marshaled in the course of an argument, but what's primary here, right? The argument that we're engaged in an interpretation of history to serve a present purpose about a plan for the future.
Yep. Very well said.
I wanted to make just the last thing in agreement with Eric. That's why I think that back when everybody was castigating that conservative American Republican woman, I don't remember her name. Thank goodness, because I remember she was really obnoxious. I'm glad I've forgotten her.
Sarah Palin?
No. Well, that's a good guess, but she was some woman who kept saying Kellyanne Conway was her name. She was something, Kellyanne Conway. I forget what her job was, but her job was to bark at me from my TV every couple days and annoy me. And one of the things that she said was alternative facts. She used this phrase, alternative facts. And at the time, I was with everybody else. Everybody was like, those are stupid. What a dummy. But then I was like, oh, okay, alternative facts, huh? And I started thinking about it, and I was like, maybe I'm going to marshal an argument in support of alternative facts. That's right. Every kind of fact is an alternative fact, pal. History is a narrative.
People have already done that before. It's called Holocaust deniers.
Yeah, that's true. That's one camp that may employ some alternative facts.
May.
You may often guilty of some alternative fact. I'm just saying, that I can see both sides that present historical datum of accusing both sides of using alternative facts, like there's a whole wealth of data about a past event, but there has to be some selected from that data, and then selecting alternative data from that initial set. That is, in a sense, an alternative set of facts, alternative facts. And so, in a way, it's like, all right, on that note, using alternative facts, I'm not going to fault you for that. Being a total Nazi and using Nazi dog whistles, I'll get you on that one. But the whole fact that, yeah, I draw the line somewhere. But
Oh, so some
alternative
alternative facts are okay, but others aren't, and you will be the judge of that.
Well,
yeah,
I think the point is that the phrase alternative facts seems to suggest if perhaps there's one acceptable interpretation and other people are putting forward an unacceptable interpretation. And if we leave it, like, use the Holocaust for an example, you can say we have the standard, the narrative of the Holocaust, and then we have other people putting forward alternative facts. The part of the problem isn't that we have competing stories about the same historical event. That in itself isn't a problem. When you use the phrase alternative facts, you seem to be indicating that in itself is a problem. We have history and we have an alternate interpretation of this history, and that's just bullshit. This is the authorized version, and that is an unauthorized version of history. And I think really when we look at Holocaust, we can dispel Holocaust denialism by careful, historiology, or an analysis. Like, what are the methods used? What is the evidence marshaled? What are the arguments put forward by these Holocaust deniers? And what are the arguments put forward by the people who have the documentation, the Nuremberg trials? You know what I mean? We can fall back on some notion of objectivity because we have a scientific method, and we have, universal categories of reason, maybe, right? But we can fall back, we can test interpretations against the standard. But I think Hunter's point is more, just the phrase alternative facts seems to kind of marshal this idea that there are authorized interpretations and there are not authorized interpretations. And we're not going to go to some standard of objectivity to measure them one way or the other. We're just going to tell you these are facts and these are alternative facts.
But I don't think that's what Conway meant. I mean, I think she
no,
meant
I
that
agree.
there are fictions, things that never happened, that you can nevertheless treat as facts for the creation of a certain kind of narrative. I don't think she was saying, I am selecting different facts to highlight. I think she was suggesting you can fabricate things and call them facts.
Alex
Right.
Jones.
Yeah, right. And I would say I agree, Nevitt. And I guess my appreciation for her statement is sort of like the way I like George Bush sometimes, and he said, "Don't misunderestimate me," or "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, you can't fool me again." And just great, crazy good stuff like that. That I'm like, wow, you're really on this. Or like when Donald Rumsfeld was on the known knowns, unknown knowns, and known unknown. I was like, what a burgeoning philosopher! Like, this is I loved Kellyanne's foray into historiology. I thought I was like, fascinating to when they say things that they don't tease out all of the implications of, and I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of appreciate that. And that's why I just like it, because I can be cheeky and say one of my favorite philosophers, Mr. Rumsfeld, or whatever. I could say that to be funny. Who recently retired American intellectual, Donald Rumsfeld.
Well, very
like
retired. He's dead.
Yeah.
Kind of retired for him, for assholes like that.
Did not stop until he died. Exactly. That fucking. But yes. Yeah, right. That's and who hopefully none of their constituents will be witnessing my criticisms. But I think that when I say alternative facts, I think it's like a Nazi and a Holocaust denier could say things like the majority, or not even the majority, a significant percent of bank and media businessmen in Germany in the 1930s were of Jewish heritage. And I would say, yeah, that is true, factually. Okay. And I have, and that's, but let's say I tell them, I think the Holocaust happened and it was wrong. And they say, oh, well, I've got some alternative facts for you. Did you know a bunch of Jewish people ran banks? And it's like, well, okay, thank you for your alternative facts, but that does not affect the argument. That would be my point, is that you don't have to listen because they're giving you factual datum. The fact that they could profess factual data about the occurrence that does not make an argument, because it's always in service of an argument. That's to what Eric was saying. My big question is not, I'm not going to dispute whether or not a lot of Jewish people happen to run businesses that involved commerce, like finances and media. I'm not going to dispute that. But why is it so important to you? Why does that bother you so much? And I think that the reason why it might bother you, that is where you would get very spurious very quickly. That's kind of my angle. But yeah, that's all.
I need to go, and I shouldn't say I need to go and then say something. There's a certain irrationality to certain isms. Some people are anti-Semitic because they're anti-Semitic. Some people are racist because they're racist. It's a circular argument, and it's all but impossible to talk to them rationally about their prejudices against different classes of people, because it is in some ways not based on any kind of what we might call factual information, or factual information that's even interpreted. Remember Borges's essay when he was talking about the German defender in Argentina? Germany was treated unfairly by the treaty. You know, it was not treated as an equal country, blah, blah, blah. And then remember Borges is coming. Oh, and so that means Germany can invade any number of countries and treat them unequally and, you know, do all those bad things to them. And he was just like saying, hello, why does the mistreatment of the one then give license for that mistreated country to mistreat other people?
You know what? I would like to ask Heidegger these questions. I wonder what he would say.
Yeah, I would too. Did you ever read the Der Spiegel interview he did, Chase?
I think I've read parts of it, but not the whole thing.
It's not that long, and I know I'm not trying to pull you away. Is it pouring rain? Well, I know you, California, you don't have rain. But
I'm in Atlanta.
You're in Atlanta now? Oh,
Mhm.
okay. There's a major thunderstorm in San Marcos, so if all of a sudden I disappear, it's because electricity went out. Well, what were we talking about? Oh, Heidegger, their Spiegel interview. My memory is that it was actually conducted in the 1960s, but the condition for him giving that interview is that it would not be published until after his death.
Yeah, I know with the black notebooks, those were his family didn't want to publish them. And for some reason, I mean, I may be wrong about some of this, but for whatever reason, they were published. And then it came out that well, I think some of the answers to the questions that were just asked would be in those notebooks from the little bit I've seen in it. But
When were those notebooks? What were the dates?
so they were written during World War II.
Ah, okay. Okay.
And it's basically Heidegger at peak Nazi.
Okay.
I think after that, maybe calmed down a little, and maybe this Nazi thing wasn't the most brilliant idea. But then again, I don't know. There's still, I mean, I guess maybe we should
Yeah,
wait
we're going to talk
till
about that
whenever.
whenever we're done with old Martin.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah. But yeah,
also,
I've got to go as well.
do you
So
know that they were going to try to publish Franklin Roosevelt's speeches during World War II, and they said, "Oh no, this is impossible. They're dripping with blood." You know, they're just really, it's like, this is Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, you know, and you know, the terrible swift sword smiting the enemy, and we're just gonna raze every city, RAZE and all that. So they said, yeah, we're not gonna publish this. So when you're getting bombs dropped on you, you have a tendency to get a bit angry.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, thanks again, and
Thank you very much. This was very helpful tonight.
see you next week.
Good.
Wednesday, no? Are we meeting Wednesday?
Yes,
Okay.
Yes.
and we're just going through the play again. Nothing new.
Yeah. All right.
See
Okay.
ya.
Night.
Bye bye. Good night.